Hello, my dear friends. If you think Victorian royal women were always clean, fragrant, and refined from head to toe, you probably haven't heard of them using eyelash curlers to air out their private parts. These elegant ladies might have worn silk and diamonds, but they wiped themselves with dirty towels that had been hanging out the previous week, used scented candles to remove hair, and considered tablecloths an indispensable item. Tonight, let us slip quietly behind the velvet curtains and witness the shockingly filthy secrets of Victorian royal hygiene. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step inside the private chambers of wealthy Victorian women, it would not be unusual to see small folded squares of imported tissue laid neatly on a vanity. These tissues, brought in from France, were not the disposable kind that we know today. Instead, they were considered luxury items, fragile yet expensive, and thought to be suitable for the most delicate parts of the body. Ladies used them to wipe themselves after relieving their bowels or bladder, believing the imported softness carried with it an air of refinement. In an era when cleanliness was often confused with appearances, a fine tissue carried status as much as any jewel. The problem was that these tissues were far too costly to use once and then throw away. Families that prided themselves on refinement would not buy them in large quantities. Each square was used, washed by hand, dried in darkened rooms, and returned to the lady's chamber. The cycle repeated until the fabric weakened and tore. What seemed like an item of cleanliness quickly became a source of hidden rot. Mould collected on the damp fibres, spreading unseen through the folds. Yet to the eye, once pressed and folded, the tissue looked as fresh as before. It is almost comical to imagine wealthy women congratulating themselves on refinement, while essentially sharing damp patches of mould with their own bodies. The role of servants in this cycle made the problem worse. When a lady finished, she placed the used tissue into a small basket. Servants, often young girls from poor families, collected the basket and carried it to a basin. With bare hands, they rinsed the tissues, wringing them out before laying them to dry on racks inside closed rooms. These rooms, thick with damp air, became breeding grounds for spores. Servants rarely washed their hands properly, as water and soap were rationed for the most visible forms of cleaning. Contamination passed easily from the hands of a servant to the tissue, and from the tissue back to the mistress who would use it again. In the dim light of such rooms, the air smelled faintly of damp linen, and shadows gathered in corners where racks of tissues hung. No sunlight touched these rooms, for privacy and discretion mattered more than ventilation. Once dried, the tissues were stacked in ornate wooden boxes, often perfumed with oils to mask the musty odour. To the women who used them, the scent of lavender or rose suggested purity, yet beneath the perfume lay mould, bacteria, and the touch of many unwashed hands. What is striking is how such a practice grew from a mix of vanity and ignorance. In Victorian London, the idea of single-use hygiene was unheard of outside the wealthiest ranks, and even then, it was treated as wasteful. Objects that could be washed and reused were considered proper. The fact that the washing was careless or the drying incomplete did not matter. The appearance of cleanliness was enough. If we compare this to today, it would be like people reusing disposable surgical masks for weeks, storing them in damp drawers, and believing they were safe because they looked white and folded. Newspapers occasionally hinted at the dangers of poor hygiene among servants, but such warnings rarely touched the habits of the elite. For them, being seen with imported tissue was a sign of status. Whether that tissue carried mould or germs was of little concern, since disease was blamed on bad air or weakness of constitution. When rashes or infections appeared, They were often hidden under long skirts or dismissed as women's troubles. Few drew the line back to the reused tissues that sat so proudly on their vanities. The irony deepens when one imagines the pride of ladies who boasted of French imports. They displayed them to friends as tokens of sophistication, never suspecting that the very fabric they praised was carrying invisible enemies. I cannot help but feel disturbed when I picture these polished rooms, scented with oils, yet filled with the quiet work of servants handling damp tissues that spread sickness in silence. Over time, the cycle of use, wash, and reuse became normalized. A lady might go through the same tissues dozens of times before discarding them. When sickness spread through a household, it was rarely traced back to such practices. Instead, blame was cast on the poor air of the city or on vague ideas of female frailty. The tissues, folded neatly in a wooden box, remained symbols of refinement, even as they delivered slow harm. The practice reflected the contradictions of Victorian life. Wealth and poverty lived side by side within the same household. Ladies paid high prices for imported tissues, only to have them washed in the most unsanitary ways by the hands of girls who lived in squalor. What looked like luxury was, in fact, an endless cycle of contamination, proving once again how often appearances triumphed over truth. The story of these tissues reminds us that hygiene in Victorian high society was often more dangerous than in the slums, at least in the alleys. People knew they were dirty. In the parlours of the elite, sickness hid behind perfumes and polished boxes. To imagine that something so intimate as wiping the body could turn into a silent channel for mould and bacteria is unsettling, but it was an accepted reality. The lesson is clear: what appears refined may conceal decay. In the case of Victorian tissues, what promised cleanliness often brought harm. Families clung to the image of luxury while ignoring the hidden dangers folded into each square. For the women who used them, the cost was not only in coins but in health, quietly eroded by mould and germs that no one chose to see. The tissues served as a mirror of the age itself, where appearances carried more weight than truth, and where comfort for the wealthy was maintained at the expense of both servants' labour and their mistress' health. To glance at one of those folded tissues today would be to see not luxury, but danger woven into every fibre. The practice may seem distant now, but the quiet tragedies it caused linger in history. Every infection, every rash, every illness carried by those tissues was a small price paid for the illusion of refinement. And yet, as with so many things in Victorian life, the illusion was what mattered most. The tale of the imported tissues reveals how deeply mistaken ideas of hygiene could become habits, and how those habits were reinforced by wealth and vanity. What was meant to protect became a danger, hidden in plain sight. The reuse of tissues was more than a habit. The glass bottles sat proudly on polished dressing tables, their stoppers etched with fine designs and their liquid inside catching the light like something precious. Inside was a mixture of menthol and strong alcohol, sold as a refreshing rinse for the mouth. To many Victorian ladies, it symbolised modernity and elegance. Yet beyond its intended use, some women began to treat it as a secret tool of intimate hygiene. Before festivals, visits, or public gatherings, they poured the liquid into small bowls or dampened cloths, convinced that the cool sting of mint meant purity. They believed that freshness had to extend to every part of the body, even the most private, and this ritual became part of preparation. At first glance, it seemed refined. The sharp scent of menthol carried an impression of cleanness, and the tingle on the skin was mistaken for proof of effectiveness. To women concerned about reputation, appearing pure and flawless mattered above all. In their minds, the fragrance of mint could mask every unspoken doubt. But beneath the polished surface was danger. It is hard not to smirk at the thought of royalty drenching themselves in mouthwash and congratulating each other on cleanliness, while in truth they were soaking their bodies in raw alcohol. The experience of applying the liquid was far from gentle. Servants prepared the bowls, pouring from heavy bottles into shallow dishes lined with lace cloths. A lady would dip the cloth and press it against her most delicate skin, bracing herself against the burn. The sting was immediate, sometimes sharp enough to bring tears. Yet endurance was considered part of discipline. A woman who could smile through the discomfort proved her refinement. Complaining would mark her as weak or lacking composure. The harm was swift. After repeated use, the skin grew raw and red, developing painful sores that did not heal easily. Infections followed, but no one dared connect them to the so-called cleansing ritual. Blame was directed instead at the climate, the city air, or imagined female weaknesses. Doctors offered vague remedies, but few questioned the practice itself. If we compare this to today, it would be like people spraying disinfectant surface cleaner onto their underwear and calling it a health routine. In the close quarters of grand houses, the scent of mint travelled easily. Corridors filled with the sharp fragrance before each event. Visitors might mistake it for a sign of order and sophistication, never guessing that it was soaked into the flesh of the women who hosted them. The ritual became a mark of status, whispered among ladies as a private secret but displayed in the shared odour of menthol that clung to their clothes. Servants were caught in the cycle as well. They handled the bottles, prepared the cloths, and later washed them by hand. With no gloves or knowledge of sterilisation, they exposed themselves to the same burning liquid. Their cracked hands bore silent testimony to the daily task. Once the rinsing was done, the same cloths might be dried and folded for later use, carrying invisible residues that spread infection further. The image of young maids handling these perfumed cloths, unaware of the harm they were passing along, lingers uncomfortably in my mind. Despite the harm, the practice persisted. In a society obsessed with outward signs of purity, few dared to abandon what seemed modern and respectable. To skip the ritual risked gossip, and gossip could ruin reputations. Menthol and alcohol, packaged in crystal bottles, were seen as gifts of progress, not threats. Commerce reinforced the illusion, with sellers praising the liquid as cleansing, invigorating, and essential. For women, appearances demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was accepted without question. Over time, stories of illness circulated. Women grew ill after festivals, their pain hidden behind closed doors. Some suffered recurring infections that left lasting damage, but silence prevailed. Etiquette dictated that such matters were not to be discussed. Doctors, bound by the same codes of modesty, avoided addressing the obvious. The cycle repeated, each generation inheriting the same bottles and the same misguided trust. The contradiction is stark. A substance intended for the mouth, strong enough to disinfect surfaces, was being poured onto flesh never meant to endure it. Yet in the world of Victorian refinement, logic bent under the weight of vanity. What mattered was not comfort or safety, but the illusion of purity that could be displayed in public. The sting of alcohol was endured with pride, a quiet suffering mistaken for elegance. The practice of using mouthwash as an intimate cleanser reflected the wider paradox of the age. Progress and danger walked hand in hand. What looked like refinement was often a path to suffering. Behind closed doors, the cost of appearing pure was written in scars that no one dared reveal. The women who pressed perfumed cloths against their bodies may have believed they were protecting themselves, but history records only the harm. It is a reminder that appearances, once again, carried more weight than truth, and that even the most refined rituals could conceal decay. This ritual of washing with menthol left its mark on Victorian households, not only in scent but in silence. The fragrance promised purity, yet behind it lay pain, infection, and quiet endurance. Ladies suffered in silence, clinging to a belief that burned as fiercely as the liquid itself. The tale of menthol and alcohol reminds us that refinement often hid cruelty, even when the cruelty came from within. It shows how traditions formed from ignorance could endure, reinforced by fear of gossip and obsession with status. In the end, the ritual achieved nothing but suffering, yet it remained an accepted custom of the time. The use of menthol rinse tells us how the pursuit of purity could mask poison in the name of elegance. In the same households, another strange habit turned an innocent tool into a cause of wounds and infections. A silver stick, meant for the ears, was taken to the tongue, leaving behind blood and scars. The silver earpicks rested in velvet-lined cases, polished until they gleamed in the dim light of Victorian dressing rooms. These instruments were crafted for ears, delicate enough to scoop away wax, yet durable enough to last for years. But among noble women, their purpose changed. They were taken not to the ear but to the tongue. Each morning women stood before mirrors and pressed the pointed ends against the soft surface of their mouths, scraping away the thin coating that gathered overnight. To them, this was refinement, a secret practice to maintain freshness. The shine of silver suggested purity, and so the ritual became part of daily life. The act was far from gentle. The rough scraping often cut into the soft tissue, leaving streaks of blood across the surface of the tongue. The women did not see danger in this. They saw only the whiteness that followed, mistaking it for cleanliness. Servants handed them cloths of embroidered silk, already used for countless tasks, to wipe the tool between strokes. The clothes carried stains from previous mornings, but no one paused to wonder if they harboured unseen dangers. It feels absurd that something designed to clean ears was turned into a blade for the tongue, as if elegance alone could make such a practice safe. The problem was not only the cuts, but the way the instruments were cared for. After each use, they were slipped back into their velvet cases with little more than a perfunctory wipe. No boiling water, no disinfectant, nothing to kill what lingered. Day after day, the pointed ends collected fragments of flesh, traces of saliva, and invisible spores. The tools became silent carriers of disease, yet their shine deceived. To the eye, they still gleamed like precious objects, untouched by decay. For the women, the ritual was tied to reputation. A mouth free of coating was thought to signal health and refinement. At social gatherings, a clean tongue was an unspoken mark of status, even though no one saw it but themselves. The irony was cruel. The very act meant to protect their reputation was the same act that planted infection in their mouths. If we compare this to today, it would be like using the same metal straw by dozens of people without washing or scraping it against the throat, and believing it was proof of sophistication. The infections that followed were slow to reveal themselves. First came soreness, then ulcers that refused to heal. Over time, fungal growth spread across tongues, leaving white patches that burned with every bite of food. Women hid their pain behind polite smiles, blaming weak constitutions or the damp air of the city. Doctors spoke in vague terms, labelling these conditions as ordinary female ailments, without daring to question the silver tools. Silence ruled, because admitting the truth would mean exposing the folly of refined habits. In the great houses, the practice was routine. Servants stood by, holding trays, offering cloths, or returning the instruments to their cases. Their own mouths went untreated, yet they watched their mistresses harm themselves daily. The cases of velvet and polished wood carried prestige, displayed proudly in chambers, while inside them rested the very objects that ensured infection would return again and again. The image of such objects, shining like treasures while carrying the seeds of sickness, leaves me unsettled. The cycle was hard to break. Habits rooted in vanity resisted reason. Even when illness spread, few dared suggest that the cause was the silver pick. To do so would risk ridicule or scandal. Instead, the tools continued to scrape, the wounds continued to form, and the infections became part of the hidden burden of noble life. The contradiction was complete. An object that represented refinement and progress was, in practice, a source of blood and decay. Yet no one spoke of it openly. The court could discuss fashion and politics, but not the sores that spread silently in the mouths of its women. This strange use of ear picks reveals more than a misguided habit. It shows how objects of wealth were repurposed in ways that carried unseen consequences. It shows how silence and pride allowed harm to flourish, and how the gleam of silver blinded people to what lay beneath. In their pursuit of elegance, noble women carved sickness into their tongues each morning, smiling as they endured the pain. The story of the silver picks is another reminder that appearances mattered far more than safety. Refinement was measured in rituals, no matter how destructive. To look clean was to be clean, even if blood pooled beneath the surface. The scraping of tongues with silver was a ritual of harm disguised as beauty, a reminder that luxury and suffering often walk together in Victorian life. It is a lesson in how easily status can hide sickness, and how silence can turn folly into tradition. The ritual of scraping tongues with silver earpicks brought pain and disease to women who valued appearance above truth. It left them with ulcers and infections hidden behind forced smiles. Yet still the practice endured. In the same elegant chambers, other objects meant for luxury were misused in ways just as dangerous, promising fragrance and purity, but delivering nothing but decay. Under the flickering glow of gaslight, the bathing chambers of wealthy Victorian homes carried the scent of perfume rather than the sharp bite of soap. Expensive bottles stood in clusters along marble shelves, their crystal sides catching the dim light, each stopper carved with ornate designs that gave them the air of jewels rather than practical necessities. To noble women, these bottles represented luxury and progress, a refinement that set them apart from the common masses. Yet inside the bottles was not a cure for filth, but merely a liquid mask. Instead of using soap, many women poured the costly contents straight into bath water, believing fragrance itself could purify. In their minds, perfume was more than adornment. It was cleansing, protective, even superior to anything as plain as soap. The baths themselves were elaborate. Water was carried in, often tepid by the time the tub was full, then mixed with several measures of perfume. The air grew heavy with fragrance, so thick that servants sometimes coughed quietly as they moved about. Ladies lowered themselves into the water, the liquid rising against their skin, carrying both perfume and the dirt of the day. They soaked for hours, surrounded by a cloud of floral scent, convinced that what smelled pure must surely be pure. It is almost comical to picture them basking in perfume, as if steeping themselves in roses could undo the grime of London's smoke and sweat. What they could not see, or perhaps chose not to see, was that perfume did not cleanse. The oils and alcohol masked odours but did nothing to strip away grease or kill bacteria. Instead, sweat mixed with dust, flakes of skin, and the perfume itself, creating a brew that grew darker with every passing hour. When a woman emerged, she was perfumed but not clean. Her skin carried a residue that clung stubbornly, and beneath the scent of violets or lavender, the reality of unwashed flesh lingered. The practice extended further than a single bath. Perfume was too costly to waste, so the water, once prepared, was saved. Tubs were covered and kept for days. Other family members might use the same bath, entering the already clouded water with the same belief in its cleansing power. The idea of germs had not yet reshaped hygiene, and so no one imagined the invisible dangers multiplying in the fragrant pool. To them, the water smelled pleasant, and that was enough. If we compare this to today, it would be like families sharing the same scented bath water for days, adding more body spray each morning, and believing it kept them clean. Servants bore the burden of maintaining the ritual. They poured the bottles, stirred the tubs, and carried towels afterward. Their own hands reeked of perfume long after, though their work left them unwashed and exhausted. They knew the water grew foul, yet speaking such a truth to their mistresses was unthinkable. The illusion of refinement could not be disturbed. For them, silence was survival. The perfumes themselves were concentrated, containing not only floral oils but also chemicals that irritated skin when used in such heavy amounts. Women sometimes developed rashes or itching after long soaks, though they rarely admitted it. To complain was to question a ritual bound tightly to pride. Doctors describe such ailments as nervous conditions or female weakness, never daring to suggest the cause might be the very baths praised for their elegance. I cannot help but find it unsettling to imagine those scented rooms, heavy with fragrance, where beneath the flowers lay only stagnant water and hidden sickness. Guests noticed the scents that clung to women's skin after these baths. They whispered of refinement, of purity, of luxury. To smell of perfume was to display wealth in the most intimate way. The fact that the scent concealed unwashed skin was irrelevant. What mattered was the performance. In parlours and ballrooms, women carried the illusion of cleanliness, their perfumes masking realities no one dared name aloud. Over time, the practice hardened into tradition. Young girls watched their mothers and grandmothers soak in perfume and accepted it as the proper way to prepare for society. The cycle repeated across generations, each convinced that fragrance meant purity. Even as rumours spread of infections or strange ailments, the connection to bathing rituals was ignored. To abandon the practice would have been to abandon status itself. In the grand narrative of Victorian life, this ritual reflects the deep contradictions of the age. A society that prided itself on progress and moral order was content to soak in stagnant pools of perfume and sweat. They spoke of refinement while ignoring decay, of purity while bathing in filth. The bottles of perfume, glittering on their shelves, became emblems of this paradox. The danger was not only physical but symbolic. By replacing cleansing with masking, these baths mirrored the larger Victorian habit of covering reality with appearances. The empire itself perfumed its image, boasting of civilization while its streets reeked of sewage and disease. In the chambers of noble women, the same deception played out in miniature. The continued use of perfume baths brought quite harm. Skin infections spread, hidden beneath gowns. Families who shared the same water passed ailments without ever understanding their cause. And yet, the ritual endured. For them, the cost of perfume was proof of superiority, and that mattered more than truth. The use of perfume in place of soap reveals how deeply appearance could override reality. It shows how ignorance, pride, and fear of scandal created traditions that harmed as much as they impressed. It also shows how luxury often turned against those who embraced it, promising beauty while delivering decay. The image of noble women soaking for hours in perfumed water, surrounded by the residue of sweat and dirt, lingers as one of the more vivid contradictions of Victorian hygiene. It captures an age where appearances were everything, even when those appearances came at the expense of health. The story of perfume baths stands as a reminder that refinement, when built on ignorance, is no more than a mask. In the silence of those dimly lit rooms, behind the glow of crystal bottles, women paid the price for rituals that placed fragrance above cleanliness. The ritual of soaking in perfume instead of cleansing with soap left its mark on Victorian life. It left women perfumed but unclean, confident yet vulnerable, and it left history with an image of luxury concealing decay. These fragrant baths, saved and reused, reveal how quickly status could blind people to truth. They remind us that what looks refined may carry hidden harm, and that even in the most elegant chambers, sickness often lies just beneath the surface. The bathing rituals with perfume were not only misguided but dangerous, binding women to cycles of filth disguised as refinement. They show us how appearances, once again, held greater weight than health, and how silence allowed harm to flourish. The story of perfume baths reminds us that beauty, when mistaken for purity, often brings harm. It also prepares us to see how the misuse of another new object, the toothbrush, carried its own dangers when nobles decided it was better suited for skin than teeth. The toothbrush, a novelty of its time, arrived in England from Germany as a curiosity rather than a necessity. Crafted with wooden handles and bristles made from animal hair, it was intended to be a tool for oral care. Yet in the elegant chambers of noblewomen, the toothbrush did not find its way to teeth. Instead, it was seized upon as a beauty device. The women saw the softness of the bristles, felt the texture against their skin, and quickly decided it must have other uses. Rather than cleaning their mouths, they pressed the brushes against knees and elbows, rubbing in circles as though this ritual might smooth the roughness of skin and restore the glow of youth. The scene was common in the private dressing rooms of the elite. Women sat on cushioned chairs, skirts drawn back just enough to expose bony knees or angular elbows. Servants stood nearby with bowls of water or jars of oil, dipping the brushes before handing them over. The sound was faint, a dry rasp against skin, repeated over and over. Hours could pass in this manner, with women convinced that refinement was being achieved one stroke at a time. It is hard not to smile at the thought of the first toothbrushes, meant to fight decay, instead becoming scalpels of vanity against the joints of noble women. The effects appeared quickly. At first, the brushing left the skin pink, which was interpreted as success. But with days and weeks, the pinkness deepened into red patches. The delicate skin of the knees and elbows grew raw, inflamed, and sore to the touch. What had begun as a ritual of beauty soon delivered pain. Yet the women persisted. Pain was recast as proof that the ritual worked. If it hurts, then it must be effective. And so they brushed harder, longer, and more often, chasing an illusion of smoothness. Meanwhile, their teeth went untouched. Without brushing, plaque and stains spread, leaving mouths filled with decay. Smiles were hidden behind closed lips, while elbows and knees bore the marks of obsessive care. If we compare this to today, it would be like people buying electric toothbrushes and using them only to scrub the soles of their feet, while letting cavities rot unchecked. The cycle extended beyond the ladies themselves. Once a brush was worn down, its bristles bent and stained. It was no longer considered suitable for a lady's vanity. Rather than being discarded, it was passed down. Servants received these used brushes as gifts, tokens presented as rewards for loyalty. To the servants, these gifts carried mixed meaning. On one hand, they were objects of wealth, rare and exotic. On the other hand, they were reminders that their own hygiene was of no concern, for they were expected to continue using tools already soiled by their mistress's skin. Servants, often uneducated in the object's true purpose, imitated what they had seen. They too brushed their knees and elbows, copying the habits of refinement without question. The result was the same raw patches of skin, small infections, and lingering pain. The irony was sharp. An invention meant to bring health and cleanliness spread harm and discomfort, its intended role completely ignored. The image of a tool that could have saved smiles instead of becoming a cause of rashes leaves me uneasy, as if history itself had played a cruel trick. The toothbrushes, displayed in cabinets or kept in boxes with other grooming tools, became part of the visual performance of refinement. To own one was to signal modernity, regardless of how it was used. In parlours, women spoke of the soothing strokes of the bristles against their skin, never of the rotting teeth hidden behind their polite laughter. The contradiction was stark, but it was also typical of Victorian life, where appearances mattered more than truth, and where luxury was prized above understanding. Doctors of the time rarely intervened. When women complained of soreness or rashes, their conditions were labelled as common female sensitivities. Tooth decay, meanwhile, was attributed to weak constitutions or poor diets. Few physicians drew the line back to the misused brushes, and fewer still dared to question the habits of the wealthy. In a world where status dictated truth, the misuse of the toothbrush remained an unchallenged ritual. The broader picture reveals something important. The misuse of toothbrushes shows how easily innovation can be misunderstood when filtered through vanity and ignorance. Rather than being applied where it could do the most good, the tool was bent to the desires of appearance. Clean skin at the joints was valued more than clean teeth in the mouth, and so, an invention that might have transformed oral hygiene became nothing more than a fashionable toy. The irony did not stop there. The brushes that passed down to servants eventually found their way into poorer households, where they were used on everything from scrubbing clothing to cleaning pots. By the time they reached these lower levels of society, the bristles were frayed, discoloured, and contaminated. Instead of spreading health, the toothbrush spread germs through the very households that needed help the most. To imagine these brushes now is to see the contradictions of an age. They stood as symbols of refinement, yet they carried disease. They were meant for mouths, yet they harmed skin. They promised health, yet they delivered discomfort. And through it all, women continued to scrape their joints while smiling carefully with mouths full of decay. The story of the toothbrushes captures the essence of Victorian hygiene at its most misguided. It was not ignorance alone that created these rituals, but the deeper obsession with status and appearance. To look refined mattered more than to be healthy. And so tools of progress became instruments of suffering, their true purpose forgotten in the rush to display elegance. The misuse of toothbrushes for beauty rituals shows us how far people will go to maintain illusions. Even when those illusions cause harm, it also reminds us that luxury does not guarantee wisdom. In the hands of those more concerned with display than knowledge, even the most useful inventions can become dangerous. These brushes, passed from hand to hand, leave us with an image of vanity shaping health in destructive ways. They show how progress can be derailed by pride, and how something so simple as a toothbrush could carry within it the paradox of Victorian refinement. The ritual of brushing knees and elbows with toothbrushes left women scarred and teeth neglected, servants exposed to false gifts, and history marked by one more example of how appearance triumphed over reality. It leaves us with a haunting picture of tools meant for care turned into instruments of harm. The tale of these German toothbrushes reminds us that innovation is only as powerful as the understanding behind it. Without that, even the simplest object can cause suffering instead of relief. The misuse of toothbrushes as beauty tools speaks to the broader truth of Victorian hygiene. It was an age where progress was celebrated but misunderstood, where appearance mattered more than health, and where silence allowed folly to continue unchallenged. The toothbrush, shining with promise, became one more emblem of a society more devoted to vanity than to truth. The ritual of brushing knees and elbows, while leaving teeth to decay, was not an isolated practice. It was part of a larger world where objects meant for health were twisted by ignorance into harmful customs. In the same elegant households, another device of supposed modernity would be misused in ways even more dangerous, bringing with it risks far greater than raw skin or tooth decay. The arrival of the menstrual cup in Victorian society was hailed as a sign of progress, a symbol that science was finding ways to make even the most private aspects of life more refined. Imported from France and crafted from tin, these cups were heavy, cold to the touch, and nothing like the discreet medical devices of later times. They were presented in velvet boxes with ornate clasps, often displayed quietly in dressing rooms as though their elegance could soften the discomfort of their use. To noble women, the cups were fashionable curiosities, promising to free them from the mess of improvised cloth pads and endless washing. Yet no instructions were provided, no guidance offered, and so the women experimented blindly. In their search for refinement, they unknowingly placed themselves in grave danger. The design itself was flawed. Tin was chosen for its availability and ability to be moulded into shape, but it was neither flexible nor safe for long contact with flesh. Inserting such a cup required force, and once inside, it often pressed at the wrong angles. Many women placed them incorrectly, scraping against tender tissue or forcing them too far. The pressure created internal wounds that bled more heavily than the menstrual flow they were meant to contain. It is almost ridiculous to imagine women smiling at the elegance of a French invention, while secretly enduring sharp tin edges tearing into their bodies. Cleaning posed an even greater hazard. In the absence of proper sterilization, the cups were rinsed hastily in cold water and wiped with perfumed cloths. Sometimes they were not cleaned at all, simply placed back in their velvet cases until the next use. Bacteria and fungi grew unchecked on the metal, clinging to every crease and seam. When reinserted, these microbes entered the body, leading to fevers, infections, and in some cases, sepsis. Yet the idea of discussing such issues openly was unthinkable. Women suffered in silence, blaming vague weaknesses of the womb or the climate, never daring to name the true source of their pain. The problem worsened because many believed the cup should be left inside for the entire duration of their cycle. Some noble women wore them continuously for 10 days, too embarrassed to remove them in front of servants or too anxious to speak of the matter with anyone. Trapped within, the blood stagnated, turning the device into a vessel of decay. The smell alone was unbearable, but to them, silence and composure were more important than health. If we compare this to today, it would be like inserting a rusting metal container and leaving it inside the body for weeks, convinced that silence preserved dignity. Servants were occasionally tasked with handling the cups, though never directly acknowledged. They washed them without gloves, holding the cold tin under water until their fingers numbed. These same hands prepared food, cleaned chambers, and tended to children, carrying infection from one task to another. The irony was sharp. A tool meant to contain and refine womanhood instead became a carrier of disease throughout entire households. Infections became so frequent that doctors began to notice patterns. They described women with inflamed uteruses, unexplained bleeding, and mysterious fevers, yet they hesitated to confront the practice. Speaking openly about menstruation was considered indecent. Instead, vague diagnoses of female disorders were offered, with remedies ranging from bed rest to tonics. The cups remained untouched in the discourse, their dangers shielded by silence. I find it deeply unsettling to picture rows of velvet cases in noble dressing rooms, each containing not refinement, but a silent threat to life. Some women who used the cups incorrectly bled so heavily that they required constant nursing. In rare cases, the injuries proved fatal, though the cause was quietly attributed to natural weakness. Families mourned but never questioned the role of the object. To them, the idea that an elegant French device could kill was simply unthinkable. Despite the risks, the cups continued to circulate, passed down among sisters and friends as though they were treasures. Their novelty outweighed their dangers, and their association with progress made them desirable. To admit harm would have been to admit ignorance, something no woman of rank could bear, and so, generation after generation, the practice endured, bringing with it silent suffering hidden behind composed smiles. The contradiction was stark. In a society obsessed with appearances, women embraced an object that harmed them more than it helped. They called it modern, elegant, liberating, while it tore at their bodies and seeded infection. It stood as yet another emblem of an age where ignorance dressed itself in the clothing of refinement. The menstrual cups of tin reflect more than a misguided invention. They show how silence, pride, and obsession with reputation combined to create a ritual of harm. They show how the lack of honest discussion about women's health left countless lives vulnerable. And they show how even the most private aspects of life were shaped not by care but by appearances. The image that remains is haunting noble women in grand chambers, slipping cold tin inside themselves, smiling as though progress had reached even this part of life, while in truth they were planting the seeds of pain and infection. The story of these tin cups captures the essence of Victorian hygiene at its darkest: progress without understanding, refinement without safety, and silence without question combined into a quiet disaster. Women paid the price in blood, and history records their suffering only in whispers. The practice of using tin menstrual cups tells us that refinement can be cruel when built on ignorance. It reminds us that silence, though polite, can be deadly. And it leaves us with the unsettling knowledge that what was praised as modern was, in reality, a step backward into danger. The tale of these cups is not only about women's bodies, it is about how society chooses appearances over truth, how innovations are misused when misunderstood, and how silence allows suffering to thrive. The misuse of tin menstrual cups left women scarred, sickened, and sometimes dead, all in the name of elegance. It reveals once more the fragility of life in a time when progress and ignorance walked hand in hand. These cups promised freedom but delivered pain, offered refinement but concealed decay, and left behind a history of quiet tragedies that too few dared to speak. The use of tin cups for menstruation left noble women injured and silenced, their suffering hidden beneath the perfume of refinement. In the same homes, other improvised devices promised to help, yet brought with them foul odours and infections, weaving another chapter of misguided hygiene. In the private rooms of noble households, where curtains shut out the soot of the city and the air was heavy with perfume, another ritual of misguided refinement took place. Menstruation, though never spoken of in polite society, demanded some kind of solution, and women of wealth turned to improvisation. Without access to proper sanitary products, they fashioned their own from the materials around them. Old gowns, trimmed with fine linings, were cut apart, stitched by hand, and stuffed with downy feathers plucked from geese or rabbits. These makeshift pads were bound together with ribbons of silk, the same silk once used to edge dresses or fasten corsets. To their minds, the richness of the materials elevated even this private task. A pad made from silk and fur was not just practical, it was proof of aristocratic resourcefulness. At first glance, these creations looked delicate, their soft linings promising comfort. Women placed them against their bodies with pride, confident that they had transformed necessity into elegance. Yet the reality was harsher. The feathers trapped moisture, breaking down quickly, and the fabric held onto every stain. Within hours, the pads reeked of blood and sweat, carrying a sour odour that no perfume could disguise. It is almost laughable to imagine noble women congratulating themselves on refinement while strapping decaying feathers to their skin. The consequences were more than unpleasant smells. The dampness provided a perfect breeding ground for fungus and bacteria. Over time, women developed rashes, sores, and infections that lingered far longer than their monthly cycles. Some suffered from constant itching, others from discharges that were quietly labelled as female weakness. None of this was traced back to the pads. To speak of menstruation at all was improper, and so the silent harm continued, disguised by the outward trappings of elegance. Servants played their part in the cycle. They washed the stained pads by hand, wringing them out in basins of cold water. There was no boiling, no soap strong enough to kill what clung to the fibres. The feathers inside broke apart with every washing, clumping into foul-smelling lumps that never fully dried. Servants, often young and poorly clothed themselves, handled these objects daily, their fingers cracked from cold water, their own health put at risk by the task. Yet they performed it in silence, for questioning the habits of their mistresses was unthinkable. The pads were hung in attics or behind screens to dry, the damp feathers drawing insects and leaving faint stains on the walls. In the dim light of those rooms, the air smelled faintly of rot mixed with lavender oil sprinkled in vain to cover the stench. Once dried, the pads were stacked in wooden boxes, ready for use again. A woman might reuse the same pad for months, even years, stitching on fresh silk ribbons to make it appear new, never admitting how foul the inside had become. The pride they took in this recycling was misplaced. To them, it was a mark of ingenuity, a sign that wealth did not prevent thrift. They boasted quietly among themselves that nothing went to waste in their households. The feathers, the silk, the cloth of old gowns, everything was repurposed. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was that this economy came at the cost of their own health. If we compare this to today, it would be like sewing together old luxury scarves and filling them with damp bird feathers, then wearing them against the body for days, believing it was sustainable fashion. Doctors, bound by social codes, rarely addressed the matter directly. They described their patients' ailments as nervous conditions or weaknesses of the womb, offering tonics and rest rather than confronting the truth. The connection between improvised pads and persistent infections remained unspoken. Women endured, smiling in public, while suffering in private. The silence was as harmful as the feathers themselves. The contradiction was sharp. A society that prided itself on moral order and refinement tolerated habits that spread disease in its most intimate corners. Noble women, draped in gowns of silk and jewels, were carried beneath those clothes, pads that reeked of decay. They spoke of thrift and ingenuity, while their bodies bore the scars of hidden infections. The thought of these women, so proud of their recycled luxury, while their health withered quietly beneath, leaves me unsettled. The practice endured because no one dared to challenge it. Mothers taught daughters, passing down not only gowns but the methods of transforming them into pads. Generations inherited the same habits, convinced that elegance could not be questioned, even in matters so private. And so, the cycle of pain and silence continued, hidden behind lace curtains and locked doors. The improvised pads of feathers and silk reveal much about Victorian life. They show how ignorance, silence, and pride combined to create customs that harmed rather than helped. They show how appearances were valued more than comfort, and how even suffering could be dressed in luxury. The image they leave us is one of contradiction, wealth and decay, refinement and rot, elegance and illness bound together in a single object. The story of these pads is not only about women's hygiene, it is about how society turned silence into tradition, how pride blinded people to harm, and how the pursuit of appearances left health forgotten. It is about how luxury materials, when misused, became carriers of decay. The feather-stuffed pads stand as emblems of an age where progress was praised but rarely understood, where appearances outweighed truth, and where silence silenced even the most personal suffering. They remind us that what looks refined may conceal rot, and that ignorance, when wrapped in silk, is no less dangerous. The practice of using feather-stuffed pads left women ill, servants burdened, and history scarred with yet another example of misguided refinement. It is a tale of pride masking pain, of thrift disguising decay, and of silence sustaining harm. These improvised pads, made of feathers and silk, reveal how easily society chose appearance over truth. They remind us that luxury, when combined with ignorance, often hides danger rather than removes it, and they prepare us for the next chapter, where another product of refinement, a bar of glycerin soap, was not used to cleanse hands but to smear across the face in ways that spread filth instead of removing it. Bars of glycerin soap, translucent and gleaming like jewels, were among the prized possessions in Victorian households. They were imported at great cost, displayed in dressing rooms as though they were ornaments rather than objects meant for daily hygiene. To many noble women, the smooth surface and faint scent of these soaps suggested refinement. But instead of lathering them with water to cleanse their hands, the bars were pressed directly against their cheeks. Women believed that rubbing the soap onto their skin would smooth lines, tighten pores, and leave the complexion shining. What should have been a tool for washing away dirt became a strange substitute for face powder, a ritual that blurred beauty with filth. The process was simple but misguided. A woman would lift the bar with bare hands, softened from the warmth of her palms, and glide it across her cheeks. The soap left behind a thin film, drying into a faint sheen that gave the illusion of smoothness. Servants praised their mistresses for their radiant skin, never daring to mention that the sheen was only dried residue. It is almost comic to picture wealthy ladies rubbing bars of soap on their faces as though polishing themselves like silverware. The shared use of these bars added another layer of risk. In many homes, one bar served the entire family. It passed from mother to daughter, from mistress to servant, and even, on occasion, was used to wipe down delicate silk shoes. The same bar that brushed against the grime of city streets would be taken up hours later and rubbed across a woman's cheek. The idea of germs had not yet shaped thinking, and so no one saw danger in this. To them, the bar's clean appearance was enough. The danger grew clearer when the ritual followed the latrine. Women, rushing from chamber pots or outdoor privies, often skipped washing their hands. Soap was not wasted on something as ordinary as cleaning after the body. Instead, hands went directly from these tasks to the bars, which were then smeared across cheeks. Every germ carried on fingers passed into the glycerin, waiting to be pressed against the next face. If we compare this to today, it would be like using a communal stick of deodorant to clean both shoes and faces, shared by an entire household. Over time, the skin reacted. Instead of smoothness, women developed redness, itching, and small eruptions that spread across their faces. The residue clogged pores, mixing with dust and sweat, turning into small infections that no amount of perfume could hide. Yet the habit persisted. Pain and blemishes were reinterpreted as signs that the soap was working, proof that it was drawing out impurities. The contradictions deepened. Families who prided themselves on refinement tolerated the sight of the same bar lying damp on a basin after being used for shoes, faces, and unwashed hands. The air of luxury clung to the bars, even as they became sponges of filth. Servants, who handled them as part of daily chores, knew their condition but said nothing. For them, silence was survival, and obedience outweighed truth. I cannot help but feel unsettled when I picture these glossy bars, admired for their shine, while holding within them the very dirt they were meant to remove. The soap bars also became part of family routines. Mothers taught daughters to glide them across the skin before social gatherings, assuring them that the sheen marked beauty. Generations absorbed the same mistake, convinced that smooth cheeks were the result of refinement. Doctors who saw the resulting infections rarely connected them to the soaps. They spoke instead of weak constitutions, poor diets, or city air, never daring to blame objects so strongly associated with modernity. The practice reflected a broader Victorian habit mistaking appearance for substance. A bar that looked clean was assumed to be clean, no matter how many hands had touched it or how many shoes it had wiped. What mattered was the performance of refinement, not its reality. The misuse of glycerin soap captures the contradictions of the age. Luxury objects were repurposed in ways that spread harm, yet no one questioned the rituals. Appearances triumphed over truth, and silence allowed mistakes to harden into traditions. What should have been a step toward hygiene became a step away from it, turning soap into a silent carrier of illness. The ritual of rubbing glycerin soap on the face, rather than lathering it to clean hands, reveals how easily ignorance and vanity are combined. It shows us how progress, when misunderstood, becomes dangerous, and it leaves us with an image of noble women smiling in parlours, their cheeks shining faintly, while beneath the sheen their skin festered quietly. These bars of soap, passed from hand to hand and purpose to purpose, remind us that refinement without knowledge is often nothing more than polished decay. They stand as emblems of an age when even the tools of cleanliness could spread sickness, and when silence allowed danger to hide in plain sight. The story of glycerin soap teaches us that what seems pure may conceal filth, and that the rituals of refinement often deliver the very opposite of what they promised. The use of glycerin soap as face powder left women marked, not cleansed. It spread infection, masked truth, and offered the illusion of beauty while carrying hidden harm, and in the same elegant households, another device of supposed refinement, the copper syringe, would be misused in ways far more dangerous, poisoning women in the name of purity. The copper syringes, heavy and ornate, were kept in carved wooden boxes as though they were treasures. Passed from mother to daughter, they were spoken of as heirlooms, tools that preserved the dignity of noble households. Their surfaces gleamed when polished, the greenish patina of age wiped away to reveal a shine that suggested purity. Yet inside, the narrow tubes and hidden crevices told another story. Rarely, if ever, were they properly cleaned. Water was flushed through, sometimes perfumed, but the residue clung. Within those dark passages, bacteria and fungi thrived, waiting silently for the next use. To the women who relied on them, the syringes seemed to offer refinement. In truth, they delivered poison. The ritual was quiet, private, and unquestioned. A woman prepared herself by filling the copper vessel with water scented faintly with herbs or oils. She believed the ritual would purify her, that it would wash away what was unclean and leave her body ready for the expectations of society. No one spoke of discomfort, though the act was rarely gentle. The liquid carried with it not only the herbs, but also the traces of copper that flaked from the corroding surface. Slowly, dose by dose, these metals entered the body, seeding harm in silence. It is grimly humorous to think of noble women boasting of refinement while poisoning themselves with heirlooms treated as sacred. Over time, the copper oxidized. The green film of verdigris that coated the insides was wiped from the surface but never from the narrow tubes. Each use scraped off more particles, which dissolved into the liquid. Women felt the burn and mistook it for effectiveness, as if pain itself were proof of cleansing. The truth was harsher. The tissues of the body absorbed the poison, leading to cramps, fever, and, in some cases, collapse. If we compare this to today, it would be like families passing down corroded water bottles and insisting they were health devices, no matter how much sickness followed. Servants were part of the cycle as well. They carried the syringes, fetched the water, and wiped the instruments with cloths already stained from other uses. Their hands, often unwashed, added another layer of contamination. Yet no one questioned this. The objects gleamed on the outside, and that was enough. The illusion of purity mattered more than the unseen dangers within. When women fell ill, the causes were obscured. Doctors spoke of mysterious female disorders, diagnosing nervous weakness or imbalance of the womb. The idea that an elegant copper syringe could be responsible was never raised. To do so would be to question not only the practice, but the very pride of households that treasured these objects. And so, the cycle continued, harm hidden beneath silence, illness accepted as fate. The syringes themselves became symbols of inheritance. A mother, nearing death, might present her daughter with the polished vessel, instructing her to guard it as carefully as she would jewellery. To reject the gift was unthinkable. The daughter accepted, repeating the ritual, never imagining that the heirloom carried not health but decay. The thought of these instruments, wrapped in velvet and praised as treasures, while silently spreading poison, unsettles me deeply. Infections multiplied. Women suffered from constant discharges, unexplained fevers, and chronic pain. Some became infertile, their wombs scarred by repeated exposure to copper toxins. Others died quietly, their deaths attributed to frailty. The true cause remained unspoken. Silence, once again, protected reputation while destroying health. The contradiction is striking. Objects that represented refinement were, in fact, carriers of decay. Rituals meant to cleanse delivered poison. Families prided themselves on heirlooms that shortened the lives of the very women they were meant to honour. It is a portrait of an age where appearances ruled, even when those appearances masked suffering. Doctors occasionally hinted at connections. A few noted that women who used these instruments grew ill more often than others, yet without the language of germs or toxins, their warnings went unheard. The public saw only polished copper, shining in candlelight, symbols of wealth and continuity. What lay within was invisible and therefore ignored. The story of these syringes reflects a larger truth about Victorian hygiene. Progress and ignorance intertwined so tightly that danger often passed as refinement. Women clung to rituals that harmed them, convinced they were acts of care. The objects became talismans of status, untouchable by reason, immune to doubt. The image that remains is of women in dim chambers, pouring scented water through corroded tubes, believing they were cleansing themselves while quietly poisoning their bodies. Servants wiped the syringes clean, polished the outsides, and placed them back in their cases, ready for the next ritual. The cycle was endless, sustained by silence and pride. The copper syringes remind us that what appears valuable can conceal deep harm. They show us how tradition, when bound to ignorance, creates rituals of destruction. And they reveal how silence, maintained for the sake of reputation, can be deadlier than any illness. The use of these instruments left women weakened, scarred, and sometimes dead, all in the name of elegance. They stand as emblems of a society where appearances mattered more than health, and where objects praised as treasures carried sickness in their cause. These heirlooms, polished and passed down, reveal the contradictions of Victorian life. They promised purity but delivered poison, offered continuity but spread decay, and left behind a legacy of suffering disguised as refinement. The ritual of copper syringes left its mark not only on the bodies of women, but on the very history of hygiene, showing how far people will go to preserve appearances and how much pain can be hidden behind silence. The story of these corroded instruments teaches us that refinement, when divorced from knowledge, is no more than danger wrapped in velvet. It reminds us that inheritance can carry not only pride but poison, and that silence can turn folly into tragedy. The misuse of copper syringes shows how society tolerated harm so long as it looked refined. It prepares us to see how the same obsession with appearances led women to use mirrors not for vanity alone, but to peer into the most private corners of their bodies, creating yet another ritual of discomfort and decay. Silver-framed mirrors, polished until they gleamed, were not only fixtures of vanity tables but also strange tools in the hidden rituals of noble women. In an age obsessed with appearances and purity, these mirrors were pressed into service in ways that stretched far beyond reflection of the face. Some women, fearful of unseen dirt and anxious about their reputations, used the mirrors to inspect even the most private parts of their bodies. Bent low or crouching awkwardly, they positioned the glass behind themselves, determined to examine every fold of skin. The act was not spoken of, yet it became a ritual of reassurance, a way to convince themselves that cleanliness extended where eyes rarely went. The task was rarely performed alone. Servants were summoned to hold the mirrors at the precise angle. These young women stood silently, their eyes fixed on the glass, forbidden to look directly at their mistresses. The shame of the moment was buried under etiquette, but the humiliation lingered. The mirrors, heavy with silver frames, reflected not only flesh, but also the imbalance of power that defined these households. It is almost absurd to imagine noble women ordering such displays of supposed refinement while treating servants as little more than mirror stands. The mirrors themselves bore silent witness to the ritual. Once the inspections ended, they were carried back to the vanity table and placed among brushes, powders, and jewellery. No cloth wiped away what had touched their surfaces. Traces of sweat and waste remained smeared faintly on the glass, invisible in candlelight, but alive with unseen dangers. Later, the same mirror would be lifted casually to adjust a necklace or paint a cheek, its role in private inspection never acknowledged. Infections spread quietly through this practice. Bacteria carried from the skin to the glass were transferred back to the hands and faces of women. Redness, rashes, and sores became common, though they were rarely traced back to the mirrors. Doctors, bound by silence around such matters, spoke vaguely of irritations or female weakness. The truth that noble women were smearing filth across their own vanities remained unspoken. If we compare this to today, it would be like someone using the same makeup mirror to check their toilet bowl and then applying powder with it minutes later. Servants carried their own risks. Handling the mirrors exposed them to contamination as their fingers brushed surfaces damp with traces of the body. They had no gloves, no disinfectants, only cloths already used for other tasks. Illnesses passed quietly from mistress to servant and back again. Another cycle of shared risk wrapped in silence. The practice reflected the larger contradictions of Victorian hygiene. To appear clean mattered more than to be clean. A spotless gown, polished jewellery, and a perfumed presence could mask the decay beneath. The mirrors, polished on the outside, carried filth on the inside. They became emblems of a world where refinement and rot coexisted, each feeding the illusion of the other. I cannot help but feel unsettled when I picture those